ends very suddenly. As though to tell you the end could come at any moment. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. All right. I'm going to be developing the theme of freedom. What's good, what it is, what it isn't. So I don't want to talk about that now. And since I wasn't going to talk about the gospel lesson in the sermon, the gospel lesson is one that kind of arrests your attention. So we'll talk about that and see where it leads us. Here, this is the close of it's not no fear of them, for nothing feel afraid, and that by very nature we're going to tremble can do to you, or more afraid of what that thing can do to you than so I mean, he is the one. If he opens, nobody can close. If he closes, nobody can open. If he is for us, it doesn't matter who's against us. Bear that in mind, and that even the sparrows falling from the sky do not do so apart from God's active participation in that event. And then he goes on to say, but even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Which, of course, if you take that literally, it's astounding. But we should take it literally. The hairs on our head. Some of us have easier situations for God than others. But nevertheless, there's a lot of hairs in this world. And the truth is, they are all numbered. Okay, so there's nothing so small that God doesn't notice it or doesn't care. So the sparrows are not too small for God to notice or care. The hairs on your head are not too small for God to notice or care. And then verse 31 says, fear not, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. So this is a common argument that Jesus will make. So he talks about how God cares for the tiniest of things, and then he points out that we are much more valuable than that. So if God cares for the little things, certainly he's going to care about you and me. So that is a positive reason not to fear, okay? The negative reason not to fear is, surely you don't think God is less dangerous to you than whatever's in front of you, so you better not, abandon God. But the positive way is, don't you think that God can take care of you and that he will, okay? So Jesus is using both of those arguments here. Verse 32, so everyone who acknowledges me before men, I also will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father in heaven. Now that is important because that's telling us something about what the ultimate end game here is. Are we going to acknowledge Christ or not? Now, acknowledge Christ can be anything from literally acknowledging that he is Lord to laying down your life for him. The opposite, of course, is when push comes to shove, you deny that Jesus is Lord, okay? So ultimately, there is this question as to who is our Lord, who do we fear, who do we love, who do we trust? And Jesus is assuring us that if you deny me, I will deny you, but if you acknowledge me, I will acknowledge you. Okay, so that sets us up for what Jesus is going to say in our gospel lesson today. The nature of the battle, and we're clearly being told that the nature of the end times is not a time of peace and joy, and everything is just wonderful. As a matter of fact, we are given a number of reasons to believe in these verses that this is going to be very turbulent and a very difficult time, okay? Which leads us to our first verse here. Jesus said, do not think that I come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. Now, of course, a lot of people who don't know the Bible at all, or just, if you were to say, is this in the Bible? They might say, well, maybe. Of course, things like that are all over the Old Testament. Fortunately, Jesus has come, so he would never talk that way. And then you could show him, look, it's even in red. These letters are even in red. So Jesus said that. I've not come to bring peace to the earth, but a sword. So what does that mean? We can say, well, Jesus doesn't bring a sword. Jesus brings peace, but his enemies bring a sword. Okay, well, that's true. But we don't want to just stop with that. The Christian faith is not entirely passive. It's not as though we're sitting here minding our own business, and for some reason or another, because we're in the world, here come all God's enemies, and they've got their swords out, okay? The truth of the matter is that Christianity is not passive at all, but it is quite aggressive. I mean, if you just look at religions across the board, just any average religious view that you have in this world, Christianity is virulent, aggressive, missionary. It does not stay in its lane. Okay? Judaism had a tendency to stay in its lane. So you had Jewish ghettos, and so they were more attuned to the idea that we must survive as a people, and we must be faithful to God as a people, and we can't let the Gentiles, cause us to lose our identity. That's actually still, if you talk to modern Jews today, that tends to be their attitude today. That is, they are bemoaning the fact that so many Jews are leaving Judaism and either becoming secularized or becoming Christian. And so they have a tendency to, if you take a look at Orthodox Judaism, it has a tendency to become very cloistered. Christianity is not that way. And where it is introduced into a culture, it tends to spread, and it becomes very threatening to people who don't want it. Understand also that the nature of Christianity is those people who believe that being a Christian is just all about having faith in Jesus and getting to go to heaven, but other than that, it's completely harmless, don't really understand the nature of the Christian faith, or for that matter, the nature of the world. Okay? You cannot expect a significant percentage of any population to begin believing this and it's not start to have very significant effects on the culture. It does. Because Christianity offers not just here's something to believe in, it offers, and actually doesn't just offer, it commands and demands an entirely new way of looking at the world. You and I may not be quite as attuned to this, having grown up in a traditionally Christian America. We are getting more attuned to this as we see that being a Christian in anything other than just name only is starting to bear and bring costs with it that it didn't used to bring. And it's not hard to imagine how these costs can get much more severe than they have been so far. But if we were raised in another culture that was not a Christian culture, we would be much more aware of how aggressive Christianity actually is. When Jesus said, go and make disciples of all nations, that's a pretty aggressive thing to say. And when you read the book of Acts, for example, and if you're following with me in the daily readings, we're going through portions of the book of Acts, and you'll see that the gospel is they're very deliberately spreading it further and further and further, and we're going to see a lot of ramifications of that, okay? It will be met with violence in places. Let me give you, for instance, that wouldn't make much sense to us today right now. Well, it will if you think about it. When the gospel arrived in Ephesus, the problem that was happening is that there were becoming more and more Christians, and the more Christians there were, the more pagans that were becoming Christians. What started to happen at the main temple to Artemis that was there in Ephesus that used to have large followings and received quite a lot of wealth from the community? It began to drop. It began to drop substantially because Christians will have nothing to do with the pagan god Artemis or any of the sacrifices that went on there or any of the various rituals and so on. Well, you had a significant number of people because Ephesus was sort of the capital city for Artemis. You know, this was a big deal. And there were riots in Ephesus because the artisans who made various gods and statues and so forth relating to the goddess Artemis and the priests and so forth who worked in the temple, their livelihood was at stake here. And there was a riot, literally, and Paul had to be whisked out of town, and one of the leaders, one of the local pastors, was beaten to a pulp as well, and other bad things happened. This happened over and over again in the ancient world as the gospel spread to places and began to displace the sort of the not just the religious, but the cultural sensitivities that were there already. We are commanded to do this. Today, not to pick on the Jews, but it just happens to come up in this context, you will hear that Jews oftentimes are very, very sensitive. I don't blame them for this. They're very, very sensitive about Christians. They don't mind working with Christians, actually, and we work together on a lot of things, particularly cultural things. We work together a lot. But they get very, very sensitive when it appears that Christians are trying to convert them. Okay? And it is considered, certainly among Jews, and I don't blame Jews for having this attitude, but it has also been adopted by a good swath of liberal Christianity, and even Roman Catholics have dabbled in this, that it is just rude and not right to try to convert Jews. Now, a cursory reading of the New Testament, and particularly the book of Acts, and you realize that's not possible. We have to, I mean, we may not succeed, and we're not to be rude, but we can't just not talk about Jesus. But that does mean that we are attempting to disassemble and dissociate somebody from an otherwise ancient and revered religion. Archaeologists might not like it when Christian missionaries go into a place and want to start converting, if I may use this horrible, horrible expression, the natives, okay? What are we doing? We are destroying that culture. We are destroying their belief system. And if you're an archaeologist, your attitude might be that the belief system of these people is as much to be honored as any other belief system, and how dare we impose our views on them. But what does a Christian say to that? Well, I don't know whether that's true or not. It doesn't matter. Christ said we have to go and take the gospel to them. So we're not really going there to destroy their culture. We are going there to bring them to Christ. And that will inalterably change their culture. It may not make them into little Americans or little Brits or something like that, but it certainly is going to change what was there. All right, so when Jesus says, do not think that I have come to bring peace but a sword, the reason for that is because of the aggressive nature of Christianity. Islam is this way too, by the way. Islam is also militantly missionary. There is a difference, though, an important difference between how Christianity moves from culture to culture and how Islam moves from culture to culture. It's probably important for us to think about. Jesus gave the command and authority to preach the kingdom. And wherever the kingdom goes, that has collateral effects on the culture that you're affecting. But we are not really given a command to set up a Christian social structure. In fact, there's nothing in the New Testament that gives any clues or any hints or any advice to a Christian who is going to be a leader, or how to set up a Christian society, what it ought to look like. There's nothing in the New Testament about this at all. There's plenty in the Old Testament. The problem is the Old Testament was a theocracy. And in a theocracy, it's very clear. God is directing that things be done this way. But the New Testament is not a theocracy, and we are not called to duplicate what was done through Moses. It's a brand new thing here, this new covenant. So we're not under Moses anymore. So we don't go into this new country and try to set up a new Israel. That's not what we do. We're here to preach the gospel. Well, how is then the society supposed to be if enough of these people begin to become Christians? And the problem is there's nothing in the New Testament that tells you. It doesn't tell you how to be a Christian king, for example. Other than, you can look at the model of David, but you have to make some adjustments because we're no longer a theocracy. It doesn't tell you how courts are to be set up or what the laws should look like. It doesn't tell us that. It does tell us things like what's right and wrong and good and bad, so that's going to affect what laws look like. It does tell us things that we should avoid and things that we ought to do, that we ought to take care of the poor and widows and orphans and so forth. Is something that Christians brought to new cultures that was not known in the ancient world. There was no such thing as orphanages. There was no such thing as hospitals. No such thing. Do you realize that? There was no such thing as this until Christians, the rise of Christianity. There was no such thing as a hospital in the Roman world or anywhere else. That is something that was brought with it because of the Christian understanding that we are to care for even the less fortunate. It doesn't matter We don't just care for our own. Okay, well, Christianity then does not carry with it any instructions for how to remake a society. The presumption is that every society will remake itself just sort of organically. What that means is that Christianity in China will look different than Christianity in Korea. And that will look different than Christianity in Africa. And that's different than Christianity in Mexico. That's different than Christianity in Britain. And that's different than Christianity in America. The doctrines are the same. Okay? The church is the same. But the society is going to look different. Okay? Christianity affects these different societies in different ways. So, and that's perfectly okay. From a Christian point of view, we do not require that if some African nation is going to adopt Christ, that they become like us. They can continue to be like they are. Only you'll figure out for yourself how Christ affects your culture. Okay? But it's still your culture. That's okay. Islam, so what I would say is this. Christianity does not work with the idea of a territorial jurisdiction. This idea came up, actually, during the Middle Ages, what was called Christendom. Christendom were those lands that were ruled by Christians, and so they were Christian lands. But this is not a biblical concept. This is just an idea that developed because everybody in Europe was Christian, so we call it Christendom. Okay? But the idea of Christendom doesn't hold up very well these days. But Christianity is still perfectly alive and well and able to go from culture to culture to culture, even in cultures where the Christians are not in control. Islam has more of an idea that if you get enough people in an area, that you do have a geographical jurisdiction. The whole idea of Sharia law is that the laws of the culture should match what's in the Quran, and a faithful Muslim nation has the obligation to impose those laws. Not sort of organically in the sense that in Christian lands it may be that polygamy falls out of favor because polygamy is not favored in the Scripture and clearly forbidden in the New Testament. So that's just going to happen. If most people in a particular culture become Christian, then polygamy is going to go by the wayside. That's the way it's going to be. It'll happen naturally. But it's not as though that you need to impose this as soon as possible in order to be faithful to God. Okay? So Islam is also very missionary, like Christianity, but it has a much more hands-on approach to what the society will look like and transforms societies more intentionally, whereas Christianity transforms society more as a collateral effect. Jesus says that we're to be salt and light, for example, and so if enough people in a culture become Christian, that's going to have an effect on the society. But it's not really the work of the church to change society, even in our culture today. We are not called as a church to fix society's problems. We are called to speak the truth, but not to fix society's problems. We are called to preach the gospel and to make disciples. And if enough people in our country are faithful disciples, then that will have its own salutary effect on the culture. But it is not our job to make sure that our culture is a Christian culture. Okay? We would prefer that it be a Christian culture because a Christian culture is a better culture. But in the end, you know, in the early church, the Christians were not majorities anywhere. But they happily moved from place to place to place. Okay, any comments on that idea? We are a militant religion, and we are commanded to continue to preach until every last person on earth is converted to Christ or Jesus comes again. Okay? That's a pretty... Similarly, in the Old Covenant, they were not to make peace with the Canaanites. Remember that? Not to make peace with the Canaanites. We are not to make peace with other religions. What does that mean? That does not mean that we literally draw a sword and we're going to destroy you. It means that in America, for example, it might mean that I have to learn to live with people of other religious beliefs. I can work with them. We can try to have a good culture, make sure the roads, potholes are fixed and all of that. We can live at peace with one another. But I am not authorized ever to say, you have your way, I have my way. They're both equally valid ways. A Christian is not authorized to say such a thing. And if the other person were to ask, what do you think about my religion? Let's say a Buddhist. And we can say, well, it's very beautiful in many ways. And we can say there's truth in it. And if we're knowledgeable about Buddhism, we might even point out some things that might be points of contact with Christianity. And they'd say, oh, yeah, I understand that. But don't you believe that really both of our ways are just equally, they're just different ways of looking at the same thing? The Christian must say, no, they're not. Well, then do you think that I'm, to use your language, they might say, do you think that I'm saved? And I'd say, I cannot say that. Well, that's pretty rude. I said, I can't help that, but you asked the question. Okay, I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just telling you the truth. A Buddhist doesn't have the same problem. They don't come to the Christian and say, you know what, you're going to hell. A Buddhist is not going to say that. A Buddhist might say, boy, you're suffering a lot. You're experiencing a lot of trial and inner torment. Just because you're not in harmony with the world around you. And here are some spiritual guidelines to help you live more in harmony with the world around you, and you'll be a better and happier person if you do that. But if you don't, I mean, that's your business. But they're not worried about a personal God being angry. That's not, Buddhism isn't about that. And they don't feel the command to go out and, you know, we've got to make these people Buddhists because they're in the darkness. That's not how they feel. That's not the nature of their faith. That is ours, okay? That's why the sword. We do not stay in our lane and just let people, you leave us be and we'll leave you be. That won't happen. Okay. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a person's enemies will be those of his own household. So Jesus is now talking more about the nature of how the Christian faith works. Okay? In other words, the things that he's going to be talking about are the absolute call of Christ. That you have no loyalties that are permitted to come between you and the call to Christ. The loyalties that are strongest in normal, well, really, in all cultures, are the family ties. Okay? And so Jesus is pointing out that this gospel will divide families, because half the family will go with Christ and the other half will not. Or one will go with Christ and the others will not. And remember, Christianity doesn't stay in its lane. Okay? So it's not like you just sit there and I'll be a Christian, but you'll never know it. You're going to know it. The other family members are going to know it. So there's going to cause division. Sometimes these divisions are very real in the sense that they come at a great personal cost. I mean, if literally in a Muslim country, a Muslim who converts to Christianity does so at the risk of their life. It is a capital offense in Iran or Saudi Arabia to convert to Christianity. It is also, by the way, a punishable crime, I don't know if it's capital or not, might be, to proselytize. In other words, for a Christian to try to get a Muslim to convert. Okay? Now, also in Orthodox Jewish families, if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof. You've all seen Fiddler on the Roof? Okay. And so we have 3 daughters, and the first one is kind of hard for Tevi to swallow because we had matched her up over here, but she's fallen in love with this guy, and yeah, he's not as good as he ought to be and not going to make as much money as he should, but it'll be okay. And then the second one, what was the second one? I don't remember. There was another one that went awry of what mom and dad want, but it was still a Jewish boy somewhere. The third one fell in love with a Gentile, a Christian. And remember how that went. Not well, okay? And the best you got is at the end of that is that there was this glimmer of hope that there may be some kind of rapprochement someday between the family and this girl. But I mean, it tore the family really apart. That is not an exaggeration for what happens when somebody becomes a Christian in an Orthodox Jewish context. From their perspective, you've turned your back on Moses. it can go the other way too, except Christians won't write you off, okay, and shun you. But it is a dramatically painful thing for parents who have a child who turns from the faith. Now, of course, a lot of the way we remedy this in our culture today is we just don't really care anyway. So half your kids go to church and the other half don't. What difference does it make? Teach your own, if that floats your boat. But if you're serious about being a Christian, that is not something that you just sit back and say, oh, well, that's just the life you want. Just as long as you're happy. Christians are never going to say just as long as you're happy. So this does divide families. It divides marriages. It divides siblings. It does. And the reason it does is not because it is by nature just a contentious thing. In other words, to be a Christian means you have to fight with everybody all the time. That is not the reason for the problem. The reason for the problem is because this is so intensely important, and we can't, there's no compromise. As Jesus says, you either for me or against me.
I do know that's true, because when I was a student at University of Texas, my roommate she was Jewish. She fell in love with a young man, and the family told her if she continued and married him, she was no longer a part of anything that they had to do with him, and they shunned her, and she eventually let him go.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's real. And as I said, it's also real for Christian families when one of the family just starts falling away. You just can't not care. In our modern culture in America is much more pagan than it is Christian in this regard. And let me explain what I mean by that. There's a lot of ways in which our culture today is very pagan. But one way that it is very, very pagan is old pagan culture that is before the rise of Christianity was much, much more tolerant of religion. Christianity is not very tolerant. In this regard, we have to acknowledge what people say. You are not tolerant. No, not really. I mean, we're not intolerant the way we often get accused, but the reality is Christianity is not tolerant. It may be tolerant in the sense that I, as a Christian, can live with you who is not, and that's fine, and we can be tolerant that way. But we're not tolerant in the way that our culture wants us to be tolerant, in the way pagan culture was very comfortable. In old Roman and Greek culture, nobody cared what gods you worshipped. Nobody cared. Because it was, all the gods were not necessarily equal, but I mean, you say potato and you say potato, and the different gods and the different religions were really just considered different ways of just kind of, doing what you need to do. And religion in the ancient pagan world was not nearly so central as it is for a Christian. Jews were the same way. For them, religion was an all-encompassing thing. But your average pagan, it was not. They didn't consider, for example, personal morality to be an expression of their religion. Their religion is you had to pay homage to the gods, or bad things might happen. Earthquakes, wars, or, pay appropriate homage to the gods, and good things will happen. The crops will grow and so forth like this. But it was a transactional thing. You went to the temple and offered your sacrifice as a transaction, not as an act of personal devotion. You didn't have followers of Artemis, I used her before, going out and laying down their lives for the honor of Artemis. That's just not, it didn't enter anybody's head. Because pagan religions were just not considered central to your life. Religion was not, any of these things were considered central to your life. And one is as good, or more or less as good as the other. The way the Romans would deal with this is that as they conquered new lands, they didn't snuff out or try to snuff out the gods of that land. They just added them to the pantheon of the acceptable gods of the Roman Empire. Okay. With the and Jews did not cause a problem with this because Jews were not aggressively evangelistic. So you could have a Jewish quarter in a city, and most large cities would have a Jewish quarter, but the Jewish quarter stayed in the Jewish quarter. They didn't try to convert the whole city to the law of Moses. But Christians, that's exactly what they did. And they were displacing, because for some reason or another for these Christians, their religion was intensely important. Not just for your life, but for your afterlife. everything. And so they could not let everybody just be. Now, so that was a problem in the early church, which is one of the reasons why you had the persecutions that you had. A lot of that was just, when you have this kind of societal change, you're going to have some rough edges to it, and there's going to be some conflict. But the transition from a pagan society where religion wasn't that central, and where everybody had their own, and so you didn't have to negotiate how I live with somebody else. Who cares? I mean, it really doesn't matter. To a society where it mattered a lot was not an easy transition. Today, our society much prefers the old pagan way. I don't care what you believe, just so long as you believe something. Or we can be even more tolerant. I don't even care whether you believe or not, just so long as we all just get along, okay? Because this religion stuff, if it helps you, go ahead and do it. I mean, if that floats your boat. And this religion floats my boat. For that one over there, no religion floats. Being an atheist is what gives them their sense of identity. And religion in our culture today, popularly considered, is for therapeutic purposes, is to help us all cope with life and get along. And as long as you don't take it, people will say things like this, religion is okay as long as you don't take it too seriously. If you take it seriously, it becomes a problem. And of course, the Christian would say, what's the point? If it's not serious, why are you even bothering? Well, I mean, I go to church sometimes, but I'm not ridiculous about it. What does that mean? I'm not ridiculous about it? I went too many times. There's a problem now. Okay, but for Christians, that just is kind of a chuckle. But really, if you're not a Christian, that makes sense. Look, if you like being a Christian, then fine. I don't mind if you go to church every Sunday. I don't mind if you give all this money to the church. You're all down there serving at this and that. I don't mind. You guys do some good things too. So it's okay. But leave me alone. All right, how about this? You've heard the scandalous stuff with I don't know if it's trans or the whole LGBT thing. We're coming for your kids, right? Do Christians come for the kids? Do Christians come for the kids? You bet we do. You bet we do. Yeah. So if they say you're coming for our kids, what do we say? Yeah, wish we could get them too. Send them to our schools. Do we indoctrinate kids? Absolutely we do. Do we feel bad about that? No. So when you understand that the opponents sometimes adopt very religious points of view, and when they say they're coming for the kids, they mean it. That's what happens when you take something seriously. Okay, that is a whole life thing like this. All right, so it splits families. It makes absolute demands and causes conflicts. It's not by its nature. That is, we're not commanded to go and pick fights. Go and pick fights. Okay, that could have been the Great Commission. And then I'd say, yeah, well, that's why there's conflicts. Okay, they told us to pick fights. Okay. Now, this one is a challenge, isn't it? Understand the context. The context is the gospel is going forward, families are being divided, communities are being divided. People are taking Christ seriously, and once you take Christ seriously, you can live in peace with the other person if they'll let you. But you can't make a peace settlement with them in the sense that, your way is as good as mine, and I'll leave you alone, and you'll leave me alone. We're not allowed to do that. And so there's going to be problems, and there's going to be challenges. And that's where Jesus says, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Look, this is exactly the same idea as when Jesus says, do not fear the one who can kill the body, and after that can do nothing. Fear the one who, after he kills the body, can destroy the soul in hell. The question of who you fear is another way of saying the question of who you love. Okay? So what is being envisioned here is not, there's mom, there's dad, they love Jesus. You're called to be a Christian, and you must confess, I love you, Jesus, more than I love my own mom and dad. That's not, he's not saying you should have more emotion in your heart, more of an emotional attachment to Jesus than you do to your own parents. That's not what this means. What this means is, as this gospel goes forward and families are divided, you're going to have situations where individuals who are called to follow Christ are going to receive an opposite calling from people very, very close to them. Their own brothers or sisters are going to say this is stupid. Their own mothers or fathers are going to say, you must stop this. Now, why does Jesus pick on moms and dads?
Because moms and dads are supposed to train their children.
Well, and not only that, but where are you going to have a greater call to loyalty than to your own parents? Right? It's not just the parents as individuals either. It's parents and all that they stand for. Think about this. You grow up in a Buddhist family and you decide to be Christian. Now, you have, whether you want to put it this way or not, you have rejected the entire heritage of your parents. Not the entire. I mean, there's other heritage. But to the extent that it is Buddhist, you've rejected it. Right? They may not like that. It may not be personal at all. You still love your parents. But you're not following them. They're not following the wisdom that they gave you. And that doesn't go down easily. So what Jesus is saying is because, there's a whole commandment about honor your father and mother. So even if it's your father and mother who is coming between you and me, what is your obligation? You must love me. The point isn't how you feel emotionally or how attached you are to your parents. It's which way are you going to go. Okay? That is the purpose and the point of this. And if you choose poorly, okay, well, Dad, if you feel that strongly, I'll stop going to church. You've made a mistake. You've made a fatal mistake. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to spit on your father's shoes and say, I will never see you again. It doesn't mean that. Christians, there's no reason why Christians should shun their family members if they fall away from the church. In fact, just the opposite. You want to keep coming after them and try to draw them back in, right? But the other way, they might say, get lost. The price for you to continue in this way is we're just not going to talk to you anymore. That's an extreme example. Usually, here's the example I like to use. This is a very common example, and that is you have a husband and a wife, and the husband or the wife likes to go to church and the other one doesn't. So the one that doesn't is probably not going to wake up in the morning and say, look, you either stop going to church or I'm divorcing you. That's not the nature of the problem. Once it gets there, you're way beyond. But the nature of the problem is, oh, do you have to go to church again? I so wanted to go to the lake today, and I wanted to sleep in this morning. And, I know this is important to you, honey, but... And it's a more subtle pressure not to take this too seriously. Because, I'm not... There's this whole part of your life that's not part of my life. It's a subtle pressure. Once somebody stands up and say, you've got to make your choice, church or me, you're beyond saving that. But it's long before that. So Jesus isn't necessarily suggesting that there's hostility in this requirement for you to love him more than your own mother or father. You may feel deeply attached and emotional and loving toward your parents, but in the end, if they try to make you choose, you must choose Christ. You simply must. Okay? And if you don't, then say what you will, you chose wrongly. Okay? So he says, whoever loves father or mother more than me, whoever loves son or daughter more than me, not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. So father, mother, son, daughter, life. Your very life. If following me will cost you your life, does this mean that if you fail in the moment, at the last moment, you're called to martyrdom, and you fail at the last moment, you lose your nerve, and you go ahead and deny Christ to save your own pitiful life, okay? Does that mean that you go to hell? It's not a good witness. We must admit you made the wrong choice, but human beings often make very bad choices, and Christ died to save us from our own weaknesses. So we don't want to say, oh, well, I mean, in the moment when it mattered, you denied Christ, therefore. If your denial is real, though, that's the bigger concern. Your denial is real. In other words, well, okay, here's another very, very prosaic kind of example. Guy's got a good, high-powered job, he's got to work all the time, doesn't have time for church, not if he's going to keep up with his good career. So he doesn't go to church very often, goes when he can. But going when he can is difficult. And the fact of the matter is, if I'm going to succeed in my business, I'm not going to be able to go very often, but I'll get to it eventually. And 10 years later, he's not only not going, he hadn't thought about it in a long time. He has made it an election. There was never any one day when he said, I'm not going to be a Christian anymore. He just suffocated his life with Christ because he made a choice. Something else was more important. Okay? So there's all kinds of ways in which we can have the choice put to us. The truth is that the cross, the call to die, can be looked at, in one sense, literally. You are being asked to confess Christ and die, or deny Christ and live. Okay? That's the ultimate. But in a much more normal, real way, every time we choose to follow Christ at the expense of what we would rather do, or what others want us to do, or what we might feel would advantage us, is a little death. Okay? We are giving up a portion of our life, a portion of our dreams, a portion of our desires, even trying to change our dreams and desires in order to be faithful to Christ. And although that is not, you haven't just laid down your entire life, you've laid down a piece of it. Okay? And the call to be a Christian is the call to set aside your own dreams and hopes and aspirations as being most important, and to recognize that the most important thing about your life is being useful to God, and that means you've got to lay aside your own desires often, and that might even literally include laying down your life. Then Jesus finishes with this, which is, he's making the point that I just made. Okay? He's taking the cross and saying, okay, whoever finds his life will lose it. In other words, if you want to save your life in this world, the result of that is you will lose your life. It's paradoxical, but it's true. Because your life in this world wasn't really that wasn't really the essence of your life. On the other hand, whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So this is the ultimate grounding for why we don't do what emotionally we might feel like we need to do. I need to deny Christ because they're going to kill me if I don't. That makes good sense. We'll just make, or I have to work. I can't, I can't go to church every Sunday. I can't be spending all this time in the Scripture. Or I can't be so obviously Christian because none of my friends and neighbors will appreciate that. So I've got to tone it down. And so you make these decisions. And in the end, if you're making these decisions for reasons that make sense, we all understand why a person would make that decision, that wrong decision. We all understand why. We don't want to suffer. But Jesus says, if ultimately you make the choice to save your life at God's expense, what you've really chosen is death. On the other hand, if you choose to spend your life on account of Christ, what you are really doing is choosing life. Okay? It's 10 till, so if I quit now, then somebody will be proud of me. If I don't, then they won't be. So let's pray. Lord Jesus, it is not an easy task to follow you, but we're not called to follow you on our own strength and alone. But you go with us every step of the way. And you not only tell us, Lord, how much more dangerous it is to go against God than it is to go against the things of this world. You also tell us how much more wonderful it is to go with our God than to go with the things of this world. How much more wonderful the life you give to us is than the life that we would try to save on our own. So, Lord, help us to hear these words, and help us, Lord, on account of them, to follow you joyfully. You laid down your life for us, and help us, O Lord, to be worthy of you. Amen.